Hello and welcome to the latest Wized tutorial covering staging environments and how we can use these across the WWX tech stack of Webflow, Wized and Xano. First, some housekeeping. I'm currently releasing the new beginner series, so this video is not part of that. I will be creating videos that more experienced users of Wized are requesting, so that I'm releasing the new tutorial series while also releasing useful content for our more experienced users. That said, if you are a beginner, feel free to watch this video. You might just learn something useful. So, we're going to look at how we can use two specific features in Xano, test data and branches, to separate out the staging versus production work that we do inside a WWX project. So you'll likely be familiar with how Webflow and Wized give us the ability to publish to either the staging branch or staging domain, which is where we are testing features before we push them to production, which is the version of the site or application that the public and our general users are going to see. So we'll talk a little about what version control is. If you've any traditional development experience, you'll likely be familiar with this. It allows developers to manage changes to code, to a particular code base, and to collaborate on the code together with other developers. So tools like Git, which is what GitHub uses, allow you to keep a detailed history of changes to files, and you can also attach comments or commit messages to these changes. Now, in the WWX tech stack, we don't have all of these features. Now, as the low-code space in general improves, we're going to see a lot more of these traditional version control features come into these platforms like Webflow, Wized, and Xano. But for now, what we can do is we can create some external processes that help us to manage our applications. Before we look at that, what does Webflow give us? Webflow gives us separate staging and production environments. It also gives us a very good backup feature. It takes these automatically. We can also take these manually. I believe that is Command-Shift-S on Mac and Control-Shift-S on Windows. But we can't create branches. We can't split off parts of our project to work on separately, and we can't see details of what was published each time a user publishes to staging or production. Those are available on the enterprise plan, but a lot of people won't have an enterprise plan, either for their personal site or for a client's project. Wized is similar. It gives us staging and production environments. It also gives us the ability to restore backups. We can preview the backups before we restore them, but we can't, again, create branches or see details of what was published. Xano is a little better. It lets us create data sources and branches of our API endpoints. We're going to look at those in a lot more detail. These are very powerful. It does have the ability to allow you to restore a backup of your entire workspace, but you do have to get in touch with support to do that. So what we're going to look at is a system that we use here at Finsweet to improve our control and our oversight over a development project. You can use this for your own solo projects, and this is also very useful for if you build WWX projects for your clients. So all of our projects that we work on have a page in Notion where we store all information related to the project. What we're interested in is this page that I call our Development HQ. You don't have to use Notion. You could use ClickUp, Asana, a Google Doc, any sort of project management tool. It's more what you track and how you track it that's important. So our Development HQ includes a change log, technical documentation that we keep up to date for other developers, and client documentation, which is for the client to know how to use their web application. Down the bottom here, we have something called publishing status. And we use this to track if it's okay for another user or developer to publish to production on Webflow or Wized, and also to let them know what the active branch is on Xano. More on that shortly. Sometimes you'll be in the middle of working on a change or an update in Webflow or Wized, and it's not ready to be published to production. Now, if you're working on a more long-term piece of functionality, the suggestion would be that you build that in a way that other users or yourself can still publish to production. You don't want a case where the client needs a very urgent update made and you can't publish it because you have a backlog of changes that aren't ready to be pushed to production. This could be creating elements in Wiz that have a conditional, so they're not going to start running. It could be working inside a separate project in Webflow, whatever works best for you. So what we do if we're working on something, it might be something that's going to take 30 minutes to implement, but we don't want to publish to production for those 30 minutes. So we would just say not okay to publish and change this icon. Then all the developers from our team or for the client's team will be instructed to check this page before they're going to publish. And then once it's okay to publish, I'll simply change that back. That's the first step. This is going to save a lot of headaches on larger projects that have a bigger development team. The other thing we'll look at is the changelog. And very simply, this is where you will enter or log any changes you make to Webflow, Wized, Xano, any other part of the project. Now, there's different ways you can set this up, different information you can track. At the minimum, we have a summary, the person that was working on it, when it was published live to production, and what parts of the project that the changes were made to. Wized, Webflow, Xano, JavaScript, you can enter others here as applicable. Then you would have a page in here where you would enter more information about the change. This is very useful to have. It's useful for you to see how the project has developed over time. It's useful for other developers to see what changes you have made. And it's also incredibly useful when it comes to backups. Let's go over and look at those. Inside of Webflow, we can see all of the backups that have been taken for our project. We can see the date, the name. If you take a manual backup, you can name it, the number of pages, the number of styles, and the number of elements. We can also preview these and we can restore them. With the changelog, this gives us a bit more of the version control that we have in traditional development. I've had projects in the past where we needed to revert to a backup and you have to click through several previews of backups to find what you need to restore. With the changelog, you can see when a particular change was made, the date, and you can then match that here. It makes it a lot easier to use backups if you do need to use them. Similarly, with Wized, inside the settings, inside backups, we can take a backup. We can name them if we take them manually. They're also taken automatically. We can edit the name. We can preview it and we can also restore it. So similarly, it's very useful to be able to come in here and see exactly when we need to roll back to a particular backup. But backups aside, this is also just a very good practice for maintaining and keeping track of your project over time. So that's our development HQ and a way of improving the way we build and track the development of our projects. Next, we're going to look at data sources and branching in Xano, and specifically how we use those inside of Wized. So what we'll be looking at today is a very simple WWX project. We have a list of actors and a film that they were in. Very simple. In Webflow, we just have title, text, we have a spinner, and then we have an item here that we are rendering a list on. And that's how it looks. The spinner appears while the request is loading. We only have a single app, a single request, and a single event. Over in Xano, Also very simple. We have a database with actors, their name, and just a film. That might not be what you think is their best film. And in the API, we have one group and we have one GET request. This is set up very simple because what we're interested in here is not the complexity, but the data sources and the branching. These are both accessed in Xano from up here on the top left. Let's start with data sources. What this allows you to do, if we go into manage data sources, is we can create a second data source, like so. Typically, we're going to call this test and we want to give it a different color. So I'll click add data source. You can go beyond 2 data sources. That is locked behind the enterprise plan on Xano, but so far we've been doing just fine with just 2 of these. What this does is it creates a second data source. That means it is a copy of your database schema. So the tables that you have in your database and the schema, the columns that you have, are the same between the 2 data sources. What is different is the data itself. So this is very useful when you have launched a web application and you need to do continuous development and testing. You're adding new features for the client or for your own project. If we take a job board as an example, that's live, the live data source is going to have the actual data, the jobs, the users that are posting jobs, the users that are applying to jobs, and we don't want to mess with that. By creating a test source, we can firstly test any new APIs or functions that we create in Xano. Let's say you needed to do a bulk update of the live data for some reason. You could first run that on the test data and make sure it works the same. In the past, when I've had to do more complex data migrations, say we build a web application that's replacing a WordPress site and we have to import a lot of data and manipulate it, I'll often do that in the test data source first. It's also useful to have this test data or dummy data for when you're building new features. You can set Wized to pull in the test data for the staging site and the live data for the live site. And this is incredibly useful when you're working on an already live application. So let's look at how to do that. Firstly, I am going to populate this information and let's give the generate records a go. It's going to be a full name, English, random 2 words, and we'll go for 10 records. Thank you, Xano. So we can't add any new tables here. It's going to tell us that the database schema is in read-only mode. If I was to change back to the live data source and add a new column, let's call it date of birth. And I don't want to generate any new records, so let's just enter some sample data here, like so. And go back over to test data. You'll see that that column has copied over. The database schema, this is called, is always an exact match, but we can now enter different data here. One thing to be careful of is just always be conscious of which data source you are in. It's going to tell you up here, it's going to give you a nice big banner and you can switch back from up here. Personally, I think this should be the other way around. There should be a big warning when you're on the live data. But anyways, the point is make sure you're aware of which one of these you have. So what I want to do is I want to pull in the live data on my live site and the test data on my test site. So over on Xano's documentation, they have a lot of useful information about data sources. We are interested in this part down the bottom, how to use the test data source with our API requests. There's 2 ways to do this. We can set a new header on our requests. that passes in this parameter to use the test data, or rather the name of your data source, which in my case is test. The other is we can pass a URL argument. We can put a parameter at the end of our requests that specifies that the data source is test. So over in Wized, we're going to go to our data store and we're going to create a new variable called Xano data source. So for the initial value, we want to do an if statement, go into our data store, and what we want to do is we want to check if the URL of the page the user is on includes webflow.io, because this is going to be our staging domain. Our production domain is not going to include this. So we want to put this in, close out of the data store, and use this JavaScript function for checking if something includes a particular string. Okay. If that is true, we want to return this code that we got from the Xano documentation. Copy that, paste it in here. Okay. Else, we want to return nothing, a nice empty string. And close this off. Okay. Then what we will do is every time we create a request, we are simply going to add this variable to the end. That is going to ensure that all our requests are going to use the live data source on the production site and the test data source on the staging site. So let's go ahead and test this out in practice. If you're finding these videos useful, please do give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and join our Discord server, or leave a comment below to tell us what future content you'd like to see. This video that you're watching right now was requested by one of the users in our community. If there's something you'd like to see, drop us a comment or head on over to our Discord channel. So I've refreshed my canvas and we'll see that we are indeed getting the test data. The way to know is the live data has the actual movies and artists, and the test data has the gobbledygook, the AI generated content. So in my settings, I have a paid plan, I have a staging domain and a production domain, and I've published to both. So if I open up staging, I will see the test data. If I open up the live site or the production site, I will see the live data. So this is just one way you could do this. It's pretty common. We've used it on real production sites for clients. There are other things you could do here. So for example, because Wized always uses the staging environment, we're always going to see the test data in here. Now you could create an admin page with a button, two buttons, one button to view the staging data and one button to view the live data. And what you could do in the data store is create a cookie and link up the variable to that, where if they have clicked the button for the staging data, it changes the cookie. And if they click the button for the live data, it changes the cookie, and just change the logic a little bit. So depending on the cookie, it will change which data source is being sent to Xano. So that's the data. Let's look at branches. We'll go back over to Xano. Up here is where we looked at the data sources. Over here is where we handled the branches. So what we can do with branches, we'll read the handy, accurate description here. A branch is a copy of a workspace's business logic, the APIs, the functions, the add-ons, and the tasks. Essentially everything except the database. And what we can do is we can branch off our current business logic and we can work with it as a separate branch. So we can change API endpoints, We can change functions, add-ons, and tasks, and they will only happen in that branch. Now, by default in Xano, you have a single branch, and that is the live branch. When you create a new branch, it won't be live, but we can change our requests to Xano in order to use a branch. So for example, we could create a branch that's only used in the staging environment. So let's click Add New Branch. We will be asked to select a source branch. This is the branch that we're going to use as the basis. We're going to copy all the logic from here. And I'm going to call this V2.1. Maybe 2.2 will be our live branch. And I'm going to go for a nice green. And I'm going to say, for testing new business logic. And I'll click Create. So our UI has changed. Like with the test data, we had a bar up the top here showing which data source we were in. We can now see that we are editing branch 2.1 while API requests are going to branch V1. And we can change those over here. So if I go to API, I'm going to see the same API endpoints in here. And we'll keep this simple. We just want to cover the basics here, and then you can expand upon this. We are going to change around this function slightly. I'm going to go into it, and I am going to change the output. Let's change something here. I am going to change it to sort descending instead of ascending. Or let's go for random. Okay. And I think that'll do. We'll be able to see that that has changed on the front end. And I'm going to go ahead and publish that. Before we link this to Wized, let's go back over here and see what our options now are. Now that we have more than one branch, we have some different options in here. As well as adding a branch, we can merge branches, which is where we can take the changes from one branch and merge them, combine them into a different branch. And we can also compare them to view the differences. We'll break these down and look into them further in a future tutorial. For now, what we're going to cover is how we can use the 2.1 branch on our staging site and the live branch on our production site. So we'll go over to the Xano documentation. There's a lot of good stuff in here, and I suggest going down through this page on branching in detail. This is a very powerful tool, ability in Xano, and very useful on larger projects. What we're interested in is calling an API endpoint from a branch that is not yet live. And what we can do here is we can add semicolon and the branch name after the canonical part of the API URL. The canonical part is the base URL, or the URL from our API group. So as the documentation shows, we will be adding the branch name with a semicolon here. So if we go in to our API group while we're in the different branch, the v2.1 branch, and if we copy the base URL and paste it up here, you can see that it's actually done that for us already. Now, if we go in here and copy the full endpoint URL, we'll also see it in here. Now, what we want to do is add this in programmatically. So let's go back over to Wized, and we're going to create a new variable, and we're going to call it Xano branch. And I'm going to copy over the logic from here. Us developers are lazy sometimes. And I'm going to go back over to Xano branch, initial value. And what I want to do here is if href includes webflow.io, I want to return v2.1. Else, actually, I want to put the semicolon in there too. Else just return a blank string. Okay. So with our data source variable, the Xano documentation tells us that this has to go at the end of our API call. With setting the branch to use, because that goes at the end of the base URL before this part that's unique to the request, we can actually put this in once in each of our apps and not inside each request, saving us some time when we're creating requests. So we can go into our base URL and we can concatenate into our data store the Xano branch. And then if we publish this, what we should see is on the staging site, we will get the names in a random order. On the live site, we should get them alphabetically. So over here to the live production site, we are still getting those in alphabetical order. On the Webflow.io site, the staging site, we are getting those in a random order each time. So we're up and running. We now have a separate data source and a separate branch for the staging and production versions of our website or our web application. If you combine this with the process we looked at the start in Notion, you will have a pretty powerful version control system for your web applications. So to recap, in Notion, we looked at tracking the publishing status of Webflow and Wized so that other users know if it's okay to publish to production. We looked at the changelog where we track changes that we make to any parts of the web application. This is useful just for a general tracking of the development of the project, how it changes over time, for other developers to see the work you've done, and also to help you roll back or restore a particular backup from Webflow or Wized. Over in Wized and Xano, we went into Xano and we looked at our data sources. We can have 2 data sources on our paid Xano plans. More than 2 requires an enterprise plan. 2 has always been fine for us so far. The second data source that you make is a copy of the schema of the first database. These will always have the same tables and the same columns in those tables, but the source of the data, the actual data and content can change. And we looked at how to change which of these we access in Wized by creating a variable for our Xano data source and changing this depending on if we're on the webflow.io domain or not. We then looked at branching. In a future tutorial, we will look at some of its more powerful capabilities such as merging and comparing, but we saw how to create a new branch, how to change between the two, and how to select which one we are using on the staging site. Very quickly, if you wanted to change one of these to the live site, you would click into it and click Set Live. So that brings us to the end of our tutorial on staging and production environments using data sources and branching in Wized. I hope you found this useful, and we'll see you in the next video.